Hey everybody, welcome to our School Medicaid Luncheon Hour. Today's topic is an overview of the cost reimbursement methodology and the cost report. Now, today also happens to be National American Teddy Bear Day, International Girls Day, Operating Room Nurse Day, and National Pickle Day. So hopefully you're finding some way to celebrate one or all of those special holidays today, even while you're participating in today's luncheon hour. I'm Bob Bundy. I'm your presenter. Here's my contact information. Feel free to call me or email me after the session. After last month's luncheon hour, somebody emailed me and said, Bob, is it okay if I just call you? Heck yes. For any of you who don't really know me very well, that's my normal operating mode. Typically, whenever I have a question about just about anything, I just pick up the phone and call people with no notice, and I really appreciate and understand when people do that same thing to me. So feel free to reach out. Now, I am kind of surprised at how many people are signed up for today's session. Very impressive, and lots of people from around the country. If you are new to the luncheon hours and you're interested in receiving automatic notification on upcoming luncheon hours, go out to our website, go to the events menu, and over on the right-hand side of that screen, you'll see a place where you can sign up to get automatic notification of upcoming luncheon hours. Now, here are my objectives for today's session. First, I'd like you all to understand the theory behind cost reimbursement methodology and the part that the cost report plays in it. Now, I'm not going to go through the cost report in any detail at all. First, it's different in every single state. And second, I just don't know the rules on all the cost reports around the country. Now, I realize sometimes when people attend luncheon hours or they see my presentations in person, they're frustrated or disappointed that I don't answer specific questions like, hey, Bob, can we bill for this? Or Bob, what code should we use for this? But again, because I'm not up on every single rule, even though I've read tons and tons of state plans for school Medicaid and tons of overviews of the cost report, I just don't think that I'm current enough to answer those kinds of questions. Second, I'm planning to present the advantages and disadvantages of the cost reimbursement methodology, at least a few of them that I can think of. Okay, so cost reimbursement methodology. Well, what is a methodology? Well, a Medicaid reimbursement methodology is a way that describes and defines how your state Medicaid agency calculates and distributes your reimbursement money under the school Medicaid program in your state. Now, a state agency can pretty much come up with any rules that they want determining how they're going to reimburse school districts, but those rules have to be reviewed and approved by CMS. Now today, there are really two main methodologies used by different states in the school Medicaid programs, fee-for-service and cost reimbursement. There used to be a third called the bundled rate, but generally it's fallen out of favor over the years and it's really not used around the country anymore. But before we walk through the cost reimbursement methodology, let me take a quick look at fee-for-service just to give you all some context and give you something to contrast. Now, fee-for-service is widely used in all sorts of Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, not just in the school Medicaid program. In hospital Medicaid, doctor's office Medicaid, nursing homes, fee-for-service is still widely used. As a matter of fact, it used to be the main methodology used around the country in school Medicaid, but it's slowly being replaced, generally speaking, by the cost reimbursement methodology. Still, it's still used a lot, so let me take a quick look at it for you. First, how do they calculate your reimbursement under fee-for-service? Well, under fee-for-service, there is a set fee for every Medicaid eligible service. So here I've got a little table with some speech services that you might find in a school Medicaid program, speech evaluation, individual speech therapy, and group speech therapy. And over on the right-hand side are some rates, and these are just example rates. They're not from any particular state or anything like that, that talk about the reimbursement for that service. So If a school district provided a speech evaluation under this table, that evaluation might take 1 minute, it might take 1 month, but the reimbursement rate is going to be a standard $125. Okay? Individual speech therapy, you can see, is reimbursed at $25 per unit, and each unit is 15 minutes. So if a speech therapist at a school district had a 30-minute session with a student, that'd be 2 units, $25 a piece. Reimbursement would be $50. Basically, you divide the time by the units, do the multiplication on the rate, and there you go. Okay. Now, here's an example of what a school district might turn in over a period of time, let's say a week or 2 weeks or something like that. They might say, State Medicaid Agency, in this period of time, we've done 2 speech evaluations at $125 each. That's $250. We've done 38 individual speech therapy sessions, but each session was 30 minutes long. That's 2 units a piece. That's $76 or 76 units times $25. And so you can see the math. And at the end of this, they say, state, you owe us $6,440. Now, again, that's just an overall example. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to it, but it gives you an idea of how fee-for-service works. Now, when do you get your reimbursement for this under fee-for-service? Well, again, it's going to vary by state and by plan, but here's a real typical example. We provide some services in the month of September, which would probably be our first month in school. We provide those services. We turn those services into the state Medicaid agency probably early in October, maybe the first week of October. State Medicaid agency has to evaluate them, check the rules, do the math, all that kind of stuff. But it would not be unlikely for us to get a payment for those services also in October. Maybe not right in a couple days after we turned them in, but maybe a week or 2 weeks later. That would be normal. So if we did that for September, then for October, we'd deliver the services in October. We'd turn the services in the first part of November. We'd probably get paid, reimbursed, first part of November. We would do that throughout the entire school year. And let's say that our school year ended in June. We deliver some services. We turn those services in probably the first week of July, and maybe by the middle of July, we have payment. And we have payment for all of our services under the fee-for-service reimbursement. Alrighty? Again, varies by state, but that's just a real illustrative example. Now, what are some of the advantages of fee-for-service? Well, there are a couple of them. One, it's simple. Pretty simple to understand, and it's pretty simple to explain to somebody. It's easy to calculate. Somebody said to me one time, simple and easy are the same thing, and that's not the case. The example I use is shooting free throws in basketball. It's simple to understand. You're standing 15 feet away from the basket, which is 10 feet off the ground. You just have to put the basket in, or ball in the net. Simple. But it's not easy if you've never done it before. And trying to shoot free throws, they make it look really easy on TV, because probably to them it is, but it's not really that easy. But fee-for-service is simple to understand, and it's easy to calculate, and you get a really timely payment. You deliver a service in a month, you probably receive your reimbursement early in the next month or by the middle of the next month. Now, of course, with any methodology, there are disadvantages. So here's some disadvantages. But first, let me say, School Medicaid as a program is really intended to help school districts reimburse them for some of the costs that they incur to deliver these mandatory services. And one rule about that is you are not, as a school district, allowed to profit from your Medicaid reimbursement. So remember, in our speech table example a minute ago, I had a speech evaluation at $125. And that might be high or low. I've seen higher and lower under tables around the country before, but $125. If it's cost the school district $124 to provide that speech evaluation, and they were reimbursed $125, they would actually be profiting from that service. And typically a school district might say, well, sure, on that one service, our reimbursement was higher than our cost. But when you look at all the other services that we provide, the reimbursements come nowhere close to the cost. And that doesn't really matter in this case. For that service, for that reimbursement, you actually made a profit. So you're not allowed to do that. And that's one of the potential disadvantages for fee-for-service. Second, it's not really fair. Remember, you're supposed to offset the cost of providing the services, but different school districts have different costs for providing that same service. So in one school district, I happen to live in the general Phoenix suburban area, and there might be a school district here that has 25 speech therapists, and you add up all their hourly rates and all that stuff, and the cost of providing a unit of speech therapy might be $30. Reimbursement is $25. Okay, there you go. But in a rural or very isolated school district, they may not have any speech therapists. They may have to contract with therapists who have to drive from Phoenix, for example, and their reimbursement rate is $100 per unit. So if the reimbursement in that table is $25 and the cost for one school district is $30 and the cost for another school district is $100, that reimbursement is not fair. And that's a downside to fee-for-service. And one of the other things about fee-for-service is that $25 or whatever the rate is, where did that come from? What is it based on? How does that rate ever get changed? And if it's not fair because it's not offsetting costs for individual school districts, then it's really kind of an arbitrary number sitting out there that everybody's using the same number. And that's not a good thing. All right, so that's a little bit overview of fee-for-service. Now let's get to cost reimbursement. First, I'm going to give you an example that illustrates the theory behind the cost reimbursement methodology. Okay, now remember, under fee-for-service, we deliver a service, we turn that in, they look at the rate in the table, they do the math, they send us a check. It's much different under cost reimbursement. Under cost reimbursement, we've got our school year, July through June or September through May, whatever it would be in your school district. And we're providing all these mandatory services, nursing, speech therapy, psychological services, or personal care, all those sort of things through the school year. The theory of cost reimbursement is at the end of the year, we add up what it cost us to provide those services, and we put those costs in the cost report, and we send it to the state Medicaid agency. And we say, state Medicaid agency, here's what it cost us. We need to be reimbursed. Well, first, what kind of costs do you include in something like this? Well, of course, it depends on your state plan, right? And what's allowed and what's not allowed. But here are some examples of costs you might see on a cost report. You might see salaries, contract labor, benefits, equipment. If your state allows reimbursement for specialized transportation, you might see fuel costs on the cost report. So you would fill out your cost report, and believe me, it would be much more complex than this. Okay, you wait to the end of the year, you add up all your costs, and I've got just some general categories here. You send that into your state Medicaid agency, and you say, state Medicaid agency, it cost us $1,400,000 to provide all these mandatory services. That's what you need to reimburse us. All right, that's the theory for cost reimbursement. Now, for this next part here, real quick, I want you to think about your federal taxes. Okay, that was mean. I really shouldn't just throw that out in the middle of a luncheon hour like that. Sorry about that. Not a pleasant thought. But on your federal taxes, which are due on April 15th, right? Nobody wants to cut a check to the IRS for $30,000 or $40,000 at the end of the year. You would much prefer, and so would the IRS, to have a little bit taken out of your paycheck every month and then reconcile it at the end of the year. And basically, that's what your 1040 or your 1040EZ form is at the end of the year. It's a reconciliation of what you had taken out during the year versus what the total you owe based on, your year's income. So at the end of the year, you might owe a little bit more, or you might get a small refund. Well, it's the same sort of thing with school Medicaid. No state Medicaid agency wants all of the costs to come in at the very end of the year and then to cut these great big huge checks to a bunch of school districts. And no school district wants to wait an entire year to get their reimbursement. So the state Medicaid agency actually makes payments to the school district during the school year. These payments are called interim payments. Now, every state has their own methodology just to calculate their interim payments, and states do not do it all the same way. That's not the focus for today's luncheon hour, to talk about the interim payment methodology. But just know that during the school year, your state Medicaid agency in a cost reimbursement model is determining what your interim payments should be, and they're sending that out to the school districts. So back to our cost report example. Remember, we filled in this cost report and we said, hey, state, you owe us $1,400,000 for providing all these mandatory services. And the state Medicaid agency says, you're right, but remember, during the year, we paid you $1 million in interim payments. So we really owe you an additional $400,000 to make you whole, to reconcile your costs. All right. Okay. Now, that's a little bit of theory, cost reimbursement, and a little bit of theory of the cost report. Let's get into a little bit more detail. First, let's talk about when you get your reimbursement, your total reimbursement, this $400,000, which is your final reimbursement. Let's talk about when you get that under cost reimbursement. Now remember, under fee for service, you perform a service in September, you probably turn it in first part of October, you probably get paid for it in October. At the end of the school year, you have all your reimbursements for that school year. Now, under cost reimbursement, you're getting your interim payments during the school year, and they may be tied to the services you're delivering, or they may not. Here in Arizona, where I live, the interim payments are actually tied to the services that we're delivering. In Colorado or Michigan, they are not. So it just depends on your state. But during the year, you're providing these services, you're getting your interim payments. At the end of the year, you turn in your cost report. Now, do you turn it in on June 30th? Nope. Because the cost report is really complex, and it's like your taxes. Your taxes cover January through December 31st. Do you have to turn them in on December 31st? No, you have until April 15th. Same thing here with the cost report. Most states allow several months for school districts to calculate their cost report. Remember, it's incredibly complex, and you have to collect a ton of data. So it's not unusual for a school district to have until November or December to turn in their cost report. So let's say that you turn in your cost report on December 1st. Do you get paid on December 2nd? Nope. Your state Medicaid agency has to validate all the information on your cost report. They have to make sure you followed all the rules, did all the calculations correctly, all that kind of stuff. And again, every state is different, but it's not unusual for a school district to receive their final payment sometime in the spring of the year following the school year being calculated. So again, in our example, the school year was July through June 2019 to 2020. Not unusual for the school district to receive their final reimbursement for that school year in April of 2021. Okay, now there are some other factors. I've really simplified and maybe oversimplified this cost reimbursement example, but I really want you to understand the theory, how it all works. There are tons of moving parts in cost reimbursement that make it very, very complex. Just think about, and I talked about earlier, collecting all the payroll information for your staff, including their benefits. Think about if you're being reimbursed for transportation, collecting the fuel costs for specialized buses or specialized school buses just for kids who are receiving specialized transportation. It's incredibly complex, but there are even more things to consider, and I've got a few of them here. There are special ratios that every school district has to collect and calculate on their own. That's not necessarily a ratio that it's at a big state level, although there are some of those too. It's a ratio that you have to calculate in your own school district. Cost reimbursement has tons of rules, including rules for individual costs that you have to adhere to. When I talk about your fuel costs, there are rules about which fuel costs you can include and which ones you cannot. And you think about all the different types of costs that you have out there. There are lots and lots of rules regulating which ones you can, which ones you cannot include. There's all the work and the data around the time study. And just about every state uses some form of time study. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. The random moment time study by itself has so many moving parts and opportunities for error that OIG in an audit recently said that the random moment time study was not an effective way to allocate costs, but yet it's still used in the school Medicaid program. Okay. And last, free care, which is being adopted by more and more states. It adds an additional level of complexity to the mix. It's going to add additional level of complexity to the cost report and cost reimbursement in most states that adopt it. Now, just like fee-for-service, cost reimbursement has some advantages. First one, because each district puts their own costs into their own cost report, every district's reimbursement is based on their own cost. Unlike fee-for-service, where it was sort of an arbitrary number in a table, your cost is based on, or your reimbursement is based on your cost. So if you had two exactly identical school districts who provided the exact same services to the exact same number of students, their reimbursements would still be different because their cost structure is different. You might pay higher salaries in one school district. You might have different maintenance fees or equipment fees in another school district. So your reimbursement would be tied to your costs. So that makes it fair. It's not arbitrary. It's not based on, you're not getting the same thing that every other school district is getting just because it's an arbitrary number. It's fair. School districts that incur higher costs to provide all these services typically would have a higher reimbursement. Again, like fee-for-service, there are disadvantages too. Cost reimbursement is incredibly complex. There's a lot of data to compile. There are tons of calculations and ratios, so a whole lot of moving parts. And remember, a time study, which is usually just a single component of cost reimbursement, it has a ton of moving parts all by itself. And all those components and all those calculations have rules and requirements around each of them. That makes this incredibly complex. Okay? Much more so than fee-for-service. And last, your total compensation, your total reimbursement is not timely. Remember, under fee-for-service, we get done in June. We probably have our last payment in July, a couple weeks later. Under cost reimbursement, our fiscal year ends on June 30th. 4 or 5 months later, we turn on our cost report. 3 or 4 or 5 months, depending on your state later, the state adjudicates it, and we get our final compensation, our final reconciliation for our compensation for that school year. Okay, so why do states adopt cost reimbursement as their school Medicaid methodology? Well, there are probably lots of different reasons, but here are different ones, a couple of them that I've seen. First, it's obviously fairer than fee-for-service. So if you're a state Medicaid agency and you want to be fair in reimbursing costs to all your school districts around the state, remote school districts, big school districts, little school districts, contract providers, employment providers, those kind of things. If you want to be fair, cost reimbursement is fairer than fee-for-service. Second one, this is a general rule that I have seen. I don't know of an example that goes against this, although I'm sure there's some out there. Typically, remember I said fee-for-service was the methodology used years ago. It's really what everybody moved to or started with, but then a lot of states moved to cost reimbursement. When they did that, a lot of states, and again, in my experience, the states that I've seen all were like this. They all experienced a higher total reimbursement statewide under cost reimbursement moving from fee-for-service. And again, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. We have an arbitrary dollar amount in a table out there for physical therapy reimbursement, which has not tied to anybody's costs. Costs have gone up. A lot of those tables never really changed under fee-for-service. So when you move to cost reimbursement, it's not unusual for total reimbursements to go up. So what I mean by total reimbursements is if a state, you add up the reimbursement for all the school districts in a state, and if it was $10 million under fee for service, it might have gone up total, 12, 15, 20, whatever it was, it went up. That doesn't mean that individual school districts within a state, that their reimbursement might not go down, because I'm sure that has happened in the past, but total reimbursement has gone up, again, in my experience around the country. And the last reason that I've seen states move to cost reimbursement is because they don't have a choice. They're told to do that by CMS. And how does that happen? As I mentioned before, whenever a state wants to make a change to their Medicaid program, they have to get approval by CMS. And if a state wants to change their school Medicaid program in one way, maybe they want to cover a new service or something like that, they go to CMS and they say, CMS, we want to change this one service. CMS has the ability not only to look at that one change the state is asking for, but to also require the state to make changes to their program any way CMS determines they need to. So over the years, it's not been unusual for a state to go to CMS and say, CMS, we want to update our school Medicaid program. We want to make this little change here. And for CMS to say, great, go ahead, do that. But you need to implement the cost reimbursement methodology as well. So in a lot of cases, in several cases, let me put it that way, some states who wanted to make a change, a significant change, or even a small change to their program, were required to adopt cost reimbursement at the same time as part of CMS's approval process. Okay, guys, I hope this was helpful for you guys. I wanted you to all understand kind of the theory behind cost reimbursement. Cost reimbursement has so many moving parts. The cost report itself is incredibly complex. You're collecting tons of data, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand the theory behind it. Why do we do this, and what's it all pointing to? So I hope you understand the theory behind cost reimbursement and kind of how the cost report fits in. I also wanted you to have some perspective on the advantages and the disadvantages of cost reimbursement. Now, when I shut down the luncheon hour in just a couple minutes, you guys will probably get an email saying, hey, thanks for attending. And I thank you for attending too. Here's a link in the email to our online feedback form. If you wouldn't mind clicking it and giving us feedback. Now, I would really appreciate it if you guys do that. We have about a 25% hit rate on that. 25% of you are conscientious enough to actually do that, and 75% of you are going to be celebrating one of those big holidays, National Operating Room Nurse Day or something like that. If you don't want to wait for the email, you want to be proactive, you can go out to our website right now, go to the About menu, click on Workshop Feedback. It'll take you to that same survey. It's 5 or 6 questions. Basically asking you about the luncheon hour. Was it good information? Was it bad information? Is this a topic we should keep? Should we get rid of this topic? It's anonymous. You don't have to tell us who you are if you don't want to, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. So here's my contact information. Again, if you guys have questions or comments you want to make about today's topic, or you just want to talk about something in school Medicaid, drop me an email or give me a phone call just out of the blue, willy-nilly, because just know I would do that to you. Thanks very much for attending. You guys have a great day, a good kickoff to the holiday season. We'll see you on a future luncheon hour.